Hi, my name is Kelli Warble, and I am honored to be able to speak with you today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I started as a physics and math teacher, but sort of transitioned into thinking about continuing as a physics and math teacher, but thinking about how all of us as teachers can advocate for policies that are supportive of STEM education for all of our students. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background from my own history and my own identity as really a STEM educator first, and how I sort of fell into being an advocate and getting involved with some advocacy efforts. Some of them more dramatic at the state level, but then some of them just sort of more local, which may have more impact on our students. And then I'm going to try to give a little bit of advice and takeaways for what the typical physics or physical science teacher, K through 12 educator can do to sort of help advocate for and support everyone as far as STEM education goes. So my story is really, as an educator, is really been affected by a couple of early experiences for me. My first teaching experience was at an after-school program at a community center in Central Phoenix, where most of my students were Spanish monolingual students. They came to the program after school because they didn't necessarily have someplace at home to go and study. And it was kind of an interesting program where we would pick the students up from school and then we would drive them home every night. So I really got to see where they lived and what their experiences were like. And I got to run the science and math activities, and everything was sort of really hands-on and tried to engage the students there. And that motivated me to go back to school. I had already gotten a degree in mathematics and with a minor in physics and engineering. And I decided to go back to school to get certified to become a teacher because of my experiences at that community center. And one of my earliest communities of support as a teacher was the modeling instruction program at Arizona State University, which it supports physics educators and physics pedagogy. And then I also got an opportunity early as an educator to participate in Eisenhower professional development, supported by Eisenhower, what they called Eisenhower funds. And I got to work with a lot of math teachers on that at that time. And so all of those really supported me as an early educator. So my early identity really was all about what does STEM education look like and how can I focus on STEM teaching and learning and engage my students. When I started out my career, I was at a Union High School, which is a really rural farming community, and I was teaching everywhere from pre-algebra up to calculus, and then also physics. And I had a lot of English language learners in my courses, a lot of kids who worked in the local cotton farms. And I was just fascinated by STEM teaching and learning and how I could have my students learn more. I transferred over to Dysart Unified District, which is a really more central city, low socioeconomic district. It had been the projects around the school 20 years before. And it was really experiencing this explosive suburban growth. And then the Great Recession hit, and we were sort of overcrowded. I was starting to question a lot about the inequities in STEM education, but still really focused on STEM education. Didn't think of myself as a policy person. I then got the privilege to work at a place called Arizona School for the Arts, which really, really empowered teachers to be advocates for their students, to help have team level meetings so we could really talk about our students and what they needed and create the needs out of that and change our grading policies and practices to really meet the needs of our students. And I was starting to feel more empowered as part of an advocate for policies that might help our kids. And in 2012, I became physics teacher in residence at Arizona State University. And I got the first time opportunity to go to more national conferences and hear what physics educators and university professors were saying. Like I met someone who had been working on the next generation science standards as one of the authors. And I realized that they had kind of a disconnect from what classroom teachers were experiencing and weren't always relying on classroom teacher voices when making things such as next generation science standards, and that perhaps they could really benefit by hearing the teacher voice a little more. I was surprised actually by it. So that kind of was the precursor for me falling into policy advocacy, which I never would have thought of myself as being concerned about big picture policies. I was so focused on being an educator. But I did get to work with a task force that wrote an Aspiring to Lead report for the American Association of Physics Teachers in fall of 2016, which is when I fell into policy. And the task force members that I got to work with were really inspiring. And one of them, Mike, he had shared his experience as an elementary science course chair in the DC area. And some of the things he shared kind of shocked all of us. He noted that he was given 45 minutes a week of class time for all the teachers in his district to teach science. So they were only teaching 45 minutes a week of science. And he noted that the average in elementary school grades was just 20 minutes a day. And you can all imagine what had also been happening in fall of 2016. The election had just finished for the presidential election. And all of us were concerned about fact-based reasoning and evidence and how to make our students into critical thinkers. And Mike noted that he felt as if the lack of science in elementary school sort of aligned with our national increasing inability to separate fact from fiction. And he felt as if the best way to get that started in us as a nation was to sort of have science in elementary school and emphasize evidence-based decision making. He felt like that was a call to action. And even more now, I was thinking, teachers have a lot to say about policy, and maybe we should be more involved. So I was really inspired by this task force a lot. And the task force itself split into sort of 3 teams, and we were focusing on how teachers could be leaders in different areas. And we had a team for instructional leadership, which was probably where I would have placed myself before, because I was really interested in STEM teaching and learning and how to make my instruction better. And then a broader association leadership, like what are you doing with local science associations? How are you networking with teachers in your area or even nationally? And then we had a 3rd team that was policy leadership, which most of us in the room did not consider ourselves as policy leaders. I decided to join that policy leadership team, which was only 3 of us, and the other teams, had 5 or 8 people on their team. And I had really been motivated because a teacher that I knew in Arizona, Mike Vargas, had recently been actually even going to the Arizona legislature to get funding for STEM educators. And he had been so successful and motivational that I thought, I'm going to try it. I'm going to look into policy leadership and see what I can find out. And I was really, really inspired by the final report of Aspiring to Lead, because it really did, the subtitle says, it's going to center on K through 12 teachers and make them agents of change in US physical science education. And I especially loved that it put K through 12 teachers, not just high school teachers who we normally think of as physics teachers, because we really need to be sort of have a unified message, I think, and that all of the educators, their voices should be heard. And one quote that was put up in the report really inspired me also, which basically says, you know, if we're making policies for education, we need expert teachers as part of the development and the implementation, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of unintended consequences, and your outcomes might not be what you meant. And this was looking back on things such as No Child Left Behind and the whole accountability and testing movement that had some crazy unintended consequences. Some of those teachers probably were trying to make a call to action around, but we hadn't been empowered to do so. So I did want to give you a little overview of what had been happening in Arizona that had really inspired and motivated me. And that started with this group of teachers and educators in Arizona that are amazing people. They had noticed a real decline in enrollment in physics in Arizona. The man on the far left here, Larry Dukrich, he had retired recently, and the high school where he retired from had gone from 13 sections of physics down to only 2 sections of physics within 5 years of his retiring. And he was very concerned. And they started trying to figure out what was happening. And they interviewed guidance counselors and figured out that a lot of students decided to take physics or not take physics based on what counselors were saying. And they found that 70% of counselors were sort of steering students away from physics because they thought students lacked the math skills to succeed in it. And so they would steer them into other science courses. Only 40% of the students were worried about math skills, but the counselors were steering them away. And meanwhile, after the Great Recession, Arizona per pupil funding had decreased by over 35% and hadn't caught up to local standards in about 2016. And Arizona was the worst in the nation as far as per pupil funding drop. And then we meanwhile had a bunch of high school physics teachers leaving the field, and we only had about 160 teachers left. And this was all based on research done by Mike and Jane Jackson. Mike Vargas is the second from the left in this photo. And so they went to the legislature and repeatedly and finally got them to consider, the Arizona legislature, to pass a bill to give scholarships for teachers. They ended up with $300,000 worth of scholarships in the first round. And it was due to their dedication. And I was very motivated by this and thought it was just amazing. So I went more to focus on policy and decided to start working on a master's degree, since I was at Arizona State anyway and got very low tuition. So I decided to start working on a master's in science and technology policy. I actually intentionally looked for a master's outside of the Teachers College at my institution because I wanted to try to network with other possible people who had policy experience. And they tasked me with getting an internship for this policy master's degree. And I ended up getting an internship with the American Association of Physics Teachers. And I was really lucky. At the time, they were just launching the Step Up program to motivate more women to study physics. So I got to be a consultant for that program. And then we actually got to develop a whole policy fellowship for teachers that we had that went on for 2 summers. And basically the idea behind this policy fellowship for teachers was that most of the policy work in education actually goes on at the state level, because the majority of your education funding is state funding. However, teachers weren't necessarily feeling empowered to be advocates at the state level for policy programs, and were a little intimidated. So we felt if we brought these teachers to Washington, D.C., to sort of do the rounds on Capitol Hill, to make appointments to meet with their own senators and representatives, and to meet with different associations around the DC area that worked on education policy, that they would feel more empowered and educated, and they wouldn't be so nervous going back to their own home states and being advocates for policies in their own home states, which is where it really, really matters. So this fellowship, the funding was secured by then AAPT program officer Rebecca Vieira, who's an amazing person to work with. And our first cohort of fellows is pictured here. So it was 12 teachers. And so I'm going to give you an idea of what we were working on. The Arizona team was really large because it was a team who wanted to go help the other efforts spearheaded by Mike Vargas. So we were working on the state physics teachers shortage, and Amanda Whitehurst, a third grade teacher who was part of our team, kind of referred to us as the Cactus Caucus. So that's the name that stuck with our little group. We also had some teachers who were really interested in working on diversity in physics, one from Illinois and one from California, John and Brian. So they were actually cooperating a lot with the Step Up program, it turns out, and were advocating for more diversity in their classes. Matt and Andrew from Kansas were really interested in integrating engineering and physics education and mechanisms for doing that in their home state. And there was a team from South Dakota who were actually elementary science educators, and they were really concerned about equitable access to science education in their state. And then there was a team from New York who were concerned with teacher retention in New York State, so very similar to Arizona. So these were the teachers that came to the Policy Fellowship the first summer and went back to their home states to work on their fellowship. Our Cactus Caucus, after the first summer, did go back to our state and advocate, and had a really dramatic advocacy success as far as getting even more scholarships for teachers, with the hope that we could get more teachers to become highly qualified physics teachers in our state by taking classes and being supported for those university classes to get more professional development in physics. So what we were worried about is that the $300,000 was almost gone completely, and the initial policy that Mike Vargas and his team had gotten passed, no money had been allocated to the Department of Ed to administer the funds. So they were just trying to give out the funds as quick as they could, because they didn't have overhead to advertise or do anything for the program. So the funds were exhausted quickly, and they went out without much marketing or advertising. So we really wanted more funding. So we actually convinced the legislators to introduce a new bill, Senate Bill 1051, to renew the program and expand the program. And our team of teachers went to almost every committee meeting that as the bill went through the Congress. And we were unanimously approved in each committee. They were so excited to hear from teachers. And not only did they give us our ask, they doubled the funding in one of the committees on the bill. And they also set aside 3% of the monies for the Department of Ed to administer it. I think we succeeded because we really had a strong coalition that we had built, and the relationships we had built as part of the Policy Fellowship. And we really, as part of the Policy Fellowship, learned how to tie our message to what the Arizona state was concerned about, which is a strong STEM economy. So we really framed our message of, we want these funds for teachers to make our students more educated in STEM and prepare our economy for STEM. And we really did have a lot of serendipity as a result of this networking and policy fellowship to meet with legislators and take action. And this whole experience actually made me realize and reflect back on times when I, as a teacher, had been advocating for policies and not really realized it. And I want to emphasize, I do think that in some cases, policies at the local level are actually much more impactful on students than trying to go through this whole big state legislature kind of action. So don't think of policy as just being sort of this a legislative policy that gets passed. So one of the things that I realized I had a question about way back in 1998, my department was pushing me to have AP Physics and Calculus and get certified for the AP program. But we already had a dual enrollment with the community college for both my physics class and my calculus class. And as part of the dual enrollment, some of the funding actually came back to my classroom to purchase supplies. And switching over to AP, which at the time wasn't the best program and wasn't universally accepted for college credit because it wasn't necessarily accepted as a lab credit, it wasn't the best for my students. And so I actually successfully advocated to just stay as dual enrollment, which didn't sound as kind of sexy to parents, but was actually better for my students, I think. So I had a success then. In 2001, when my school was being rebuilt, I was able to meet with the architects to give them a whole floor plan for how I wanted my physics classroom to look. And I realized this was really advocating for a policy on how the classroom layout would be. I wanted movable lab stations. I wanted places where I could have circle whiteboard meetings. I did not want sinks because the water got all over my electronic probes. I was an abject failure on that. And I think it's because I went in alone. We didn't go in as a science department team and say, this is what we need. In the end, we had fixed lab stations with water, no flexible floor plans. It was not good. And in 2008, I had questioned my district in Dysart at that time about their testing policies. They decided that we had this high stakes testing movement and we needed to prepare our kids. And they started giving tests, high stakes tests that were district level every quarter to my Algebra 2 students and Algebra 1 students. And the tests were poorly designed and really long, and we ended up just taking a lot of time out of class without really preparing our students for anything. I questioned it, but I was a failure in making any changes. And again, I think it's because I worked alone and I didn't really have solutions at the time. So I realized that I had really been advocating for policies, but maybe not doing the best job at it. So looking back on how I had advocated alone and not been successful, and how the team of teachers had been more successful together, I do have some advice. And one of them is that we really are policy makers and policy deciders and policy influencers all the time as classroom teachers. And we shouldn't be scared and shy away from that. And we shouldn't conflate policy and politics. None of us want to be political in our classes, but we should advocate for STEM education that's going to empower our students. The other thing is that teamwork is so key. Having a coalition of people who are all working towards the same goal and can give a different lens on why we want it is really powerful. And so working together as a team is really great. And then as other team members hear about initiatives that are coming up, you can be really strategic and talk to each other as partners. And then when public meetings come up, you can say, oh, hey, Melissa, I know you have this issue in your classroom. Can you speak at this public meeting so that we can give a snapshot of what this policy will look like there? And then another thing is to have solutions that are ready for some of the major challenges that are coming up. So if you know, like right now, I know that equity, diversity, and inclusion is going to be coming up as a huge issue as a result of the pandemic learning. So I could immediately say to administrators, hey, look, there's these great lessons from Step Up. We can start implementing these lessons now. And here's the underrepresentation curriculum. Maybe we can do that. And here's how we can do it wider. And here's what we can do. So if you're prepared with solutions before these big issues come up, you can then, when the policy window opens, you can say, look, we already have this idea ready to go. Why don't you help us get this implemented? And then if I was going to just give a little advice to the physics and physical science teachers in this network about what you can do, one of the things one of my policy fellows emphasized was just show up. Sometimes just showing up for each other to different locations can support these policies and one another and have really great results. So consider joining local associations of teachers, consider helping network with your middle school teachers to train them in something like CASEL lessons. Seek out cohort-based PD so that you're part of networks. And then even just check in with your students about their stress during remote learning if you're in that kind of situation. And use lessons that are available to you from Step Up and the Underrepresentation Curriculum Project. Another thing is really try to amplify your voice and the voice of those pushing for high quality STEM education for students. Talk to your guidance counselors and the prerequisite course teachers to ensure that you're getting a diverse population of students encouraged to take challenging STEM courses, and use the message where you're empowering students and you're saying not all student has to be a STEM major, but we want them to be empowered to seek any degree they want once they get to the university. So perhaps we should challenge them to take very challenging STEM courses as high school students. Even consider having students present at board meetings. I had my students bring motion sensors to a board meeting once way back when I was in Buckeye to show why I wanted this equipment. And then don't be afraid to question the status quo. I think sometimes we go along with things like everybody needs to take AP classes, and AP is fine, but if all of the resources for the test are going to the college board instead of staying local, maybe we should question that. Maybe we should question advising structures or bell schedules or things like that. So don't just take everything for granted and question some of these issues. And I think finally, I want to end with a quote from my friend Amanda Whitehurst, who she was a third grade teacher who joined our policy team in Arizona and really increased her confidence in being a STEM teaching advocate. And she really wanted to say, really as teachers, we're already equipped with the things that we need in order to affect change. And we are used to building coalitions as teachers, and we can all work towards goals that will empower our teachers and empower our students to be more prepared for the STEM economy. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to also end with the fact that we will have a follow-up Q&A session for this talk, and it's going to occur on April 3rd. And I am definitely going to be joined by some of the Arizona Policy Fellows, and there might be a few more joining us. I haven't necessarily gotten their commitment yet, but Amanda Whitehurst, who's now president of STEM Teachers Phoenix, Mike Vargas, who really was the instigator of most of this, who is now working as an Einstein Fellow in DC this year, and Melissa Gurmscheid, who's a physics first and a computational modeling and physics teacher at West Point High School in Tolleson. So they will be joining me for sure, and I hope you can join us for Q&A and talk to some of my fellow policy advocates. Thank you very much.